Hello, and welcome to the Curious Wanderer Bible Study. We've taken a bit of a hiatus, but we're going to try and get back in the groove with this. Today, we're talking about Genesis 20, and there's a really interesting moral in this, at least as I've read it more recently here. It seems to be talking about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and also some really interesting advice on how to behave if you ever find yourself in that situation. So, to recap where we are, we have Abraham and Sarah, now actually named Abraham and Sarah. God has changed their names. He's promised Abraham and Sarah that they will have a child. And spoiler alert, we know they do later on, Isaac. But in the meantime, God has already rescued Abraham's nephew, Lot, from the destruction at Sodom. And in regards to the promise of a child, they know that God's going to give them a child, and yet they still panic. And Abraham and Sarah decide to take matters into their own hands because it's not happening fast enough. And we have the whole issue and drama around Abraham having a child with Sarah's slave, Ishmael, and bringing Ishmael into the world and all of the trouble that comes from that. So that's where we're at the moment. Now, that's where Genesis 20 picks up. In Genesis 20, we hear at the very beginning that, it says, quote from verse 1, "From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar." So he's moved on to a new place. We're not exactly sure why, but he's in a new place. The overview of the story that happens here, and then we'll get into some details, is he hears or jumps to the conclusion that the people in this new land have no fear of God. Therefore, he decides to repeat the idea that quote unquote worked for him in Egypt and say that Sarah's not his wife, instead, that she's his sister. There's a little bit of truth to that. We'll get to it in a minute. The king of the area, Abimelech, decides to marry Sarah because she's not married. And so that's great, except, of course, she is married. And before they can consummate the marriage, God intervenes to Abimelech in a dream. And Abimelech says, "Hey, listen, I didn't know anything was going on here. I thought I was doing what's right." But says, "Of course, I'll give Sarah back and we'll make this right." Abimelech is upset with Abraham as a result of this and has a discussion with him and eventually says, "Okay, just to show everything's good here, I'm going to not only disclaim any claim on Sarah, but I'll actually give you a reward as well, just to prove that there's no hard feelings here." So, in this story, how do I see this as a story about the danger of jumping to conclusions? Well, once Abraham is confronted by Abimelech, so Abimelech is the king who has Sarah in his harem, has yet to consummate anything, but has her there. When he decides to give Sarah back and confronts Abraham about this, Abraham says, so in verse 10, Abimelech says to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" In other words, why did you do this? And in verse 11, Abraham says, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." So he jumped to a conclusion about what the people were like there. He didn't go and visit. Without knowing the people, he did this thing, this behavior that had dramatic consequences. It was only because God intervened in a dream, as we hear in verse 3, in verse 2. In verse 3. So, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken, for she is a man's wife." Now, Abimelech, starting in chapter 4, now Abimelech had not approached her, and continues. So, if God hadn't intervened, a lot of trauma would have happened because Abraham jumped to conclusions. He didn't investigate it himself. He just thought, I believe this, therefore it's true. But it wasn't, and he had really bad behavior because of it. Another example of this sort of jumping to conclusions based upon past problems or whatever you bring to a situation is a soldier, after returning home from active duty, might mistake someone behind them tapping them on the shoulder for someone for mortal danger and knock that person out who was just trying to say hi. In the past, whenever he was in active duty, anything strange like that could have been mortal danger, and so of course he would react appropriately. But that's not where he's at now. That's not where the soldier's at. And the same thing's true for Abraham. He's probably been in places where people had no fear of God and it was dangerous. So he jumped to the conclusion the same was true here and almost had dramatic consequences for it. Sometimes it takes God intervening, like in the verses that we just read, for us to be rescued from a poor hypothesis. If we're lucky, God can help show us that we have made a bad choice. He can tell us, or he can put friends in our lives to help guide us and make sure we see these bad hypotheses we have, that jumping to conclusions that we may do. We learn from this the pattern what to do if we ever find ourselves in this kind of mess. Abimelech is a great example of how to behave if we're ever on the receiving end of people jumping to conclusions about us. First, explain yourself, as Abimelech does. Whenever the Lord comes to him in a dream, Abimelech says, starting in verse 4, he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not say, this is Abraham, he's saying, did not Abraham say, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God responds basically, yes, I know that. And it's time for you to stop now that you know that you've done something, that this is a problem. And Abimelech does. So as soon as he finds out that he's been put in this position, he stops the behavior. Then he confronts Abraham with a willingness to resolve the issue. He doesn't just confront him and say, why did you do this? You're a bad guy. He comes to him and said, starting in verse 9, Abimelech called Abraham to him and said, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you've brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, again, starting verse 10, what did you see that you did this thing? So he brings forth his complaint to Abraham, who jumped to conclusions. He gives Abraham a chance to respond, and then he resolves the issue. In verse 13, he continues, and then, verse 14, then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where you please. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. So there's two sides to the coin here. We are both shown the dangers of jumping to conclusions, the hope that someone will help us, if it's God or a friend who helps us or someone else, to see that we've jumped to conclusions. And then if we're on the receiving end, we also see how to resolve that situation quickly. So it's a beautiful story here in chapter 20 of Abraham. Really is not the hero of this at all. Abimelech is the hero of this story. Abraham is rather cowardly and doesn't stand up for either his wife or for his life, or even to just do basic investigation. We all find ourselves in those places sometimes where we just short circuit logic and reason and thinking through things and just jump to faulty conclusions. We need to be aware of those situations and have people around us who can help us so that when we do fall into that, they can help guide us back. And always reading the Word of God can help us in that as well. Just knowing and being conscious of these sorts of things playing out in our lives as we see it play out in others' lives in the Bible. Well, that's about it. I hope that you've enjoyed the show, and we'll continue on. See you next time.